We turn now to look at the uprising against police brutality and racism following the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May 25th. The protests have helped dramatically shift public opinion on policing and systemic racism as Defund the Police becomes a rallying cry of the movement. Well, for more on this historic moment, we turn to the legendary activist and scholar Angela Davis, professor emerita at the University of California, Santa Cruz. For half a century, Angela Davis has been one of the most influential activists and intellectuals in the United States and an icon of the Black liberation movement. I interviewed her in early June and asked her if she thought this moment is truly a turning point.
This is an extraordinary moment. I've never experienced anything like the conditions we are currently experiencing. The conjuncture created by the COVID-19 pandemic and the recognition of the systemic racism that has been rendered visible under these conditions because of the disproportionate deaths in Black and Latinx communities. And this is a moment I don't know whether I ever expected to experience. When the protests began, of course, around the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Tony McDade and many others who've lost their lives to racist state violence and vigilante violence. When these protests erupted, I remembered something that I've said many times to encourage activists who often feel that the work that they do is not leading to tangible results. I often ask them to consider the very long trajectory of Black struggles, and what has been most important is the forging of legacies and new arenas of struggle that can be handed down to younger generations. But I've often said, one never knows when conditions may give rise to a conjuncture such as the current one that rapidly shifts popular consciousness and suddenly allows us to move in the direction of radical change. If one does not engage in the ongoing work, when such a moment arises, we cannot take advantage of the opportunities to change. And of course, this moment will pass. The intensity of the current demonstrations cannot be sustained over time, but we will have to be ready to shift gears and address these issues in different arenas, including, of course, the electoral arena.
Angela Davis, you've long been a leader of the critical resistance movement, the abolition movement. And I'm wondering if you can explain the demand as you see it, what you feel needs to be done around defunding the police, and then around prison abolition.
Well, the call to defund the police is, I think, an abolitionist demand. But it reflects only one aspect of the process represented by the demand. Defunding the police is not simply about withdrawing funding for law enforcement and doing nothing else. And it appears as if this is the rather superficial understanding that has caused Biden to move in the direction he's moving in. It's about shifting public funds to new services and new institutions, mental health counselors who can respond to people who are in crisis without arms. It's about shifting funding to education, to housing, to recreation. All of these things help to create security and safety. It's about learning that safety, safeguarded by violence, is not really safety. And I would say that abolition is not primarily a negative strategy. It's not primarily about dismantling, getting rid of, but it's about re-envisioning. It's about building anew. And I would argue that abolition is a feminist strategy, and one sees in these abolitionist demands that are emerging the pivotal influence of feminist theories and practices.
Explain that further.
I want us to see feminism not only as addressing issues of gender, but rather as a methodological approach of understanding the intersectionality of struggles and issues. Abolition feminism counters carceral feminism, which has unfortunately assumed that issues such as violence against women can be effectively addressed by using police force, by using imprisonment as a solution. And of course, we know that Joseph Biden in 1994, who claims that the Violence Against Women Act was such an important moment in his career, the Violence Against Women Act was couched within the 1994 Crime Act, the Clinton Crime Act. And what we're calling for is a process of decriminalization, not recognizing that that threats to safety, threats to security come not primarily from what is defined as crime, but rather from the failure of institutions in our country to address issues of health, issues of violence, education, etc. So abolition is really about rethinking the kind of future we want, the social future, the economic future, the political future. It's about revolution, I would argue.
You write in Freedom is a Constant Struggle, neoliberal ideology drives us to focus on individuals, ourselves, individual victims, individual perpetrators. But how is it possible to solve the massive problem of racist state violence by calling upon individual police officers to bear the burden of that history and to assume that by prosecuting them, by exacting our revenge on them, we would have somehow made progress in eradicating racism? So explain what exactly you're demanding.
Well, neoliberal logic assumes that the fundamental unit of society is the individual, and I would say the abstract individual. According to that logic, Black people can combat racism by pulling themselves up by their own individual bootstraps. That logic recognizes, or fails rather, to recognize that there are institutional barriers that cannot be brought down by individual determination. If a Black person is materially unable to attend the university, the solution is not affirmative action, they argue, but rather the person simply needs to work harder, get good grades, and do what is necessary in order to acquire the funds to pay for tuition. Neoliberal logic deters us from thinking about the simpler solution, which is free education. I'm thinking about the fact that we have been aware of the need for these institutional strategies at least since 1935, and of course before, but I'm choosing 1935 because that was the year when W.E.B. Du Bois published his journal, Black Reconstruction in America. And the question was not, what should individual Black people do, but rather how to reorganize and restructure post-slavery society in order to guarantee the incorporation of those who had been formerly enslaved. The society could not remain the same, or should not have remained the same. Neoliberalism resists change at the individual level. It asks the individual to adapt to conditions of capitalism, to conditions of racism.
I wanted to ask you, Angela Davis, about the monuments to racists, colonizers, Confederates that are continuing to fall across the United States and around the world. Did you think you would ever see this? You think about Bree Newsom, after the horror at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, who shimmied up that flagpole on the grounds of the South Carolina legislature and took down the Confederate flag, and they put it right on back up. What about what we're seeing today?
Well, of course, Bree Newsom was a wonderful pioneer, and I think it's important to link this trend to the campaign in South Africa, Rhodes Must Fall. And of course, I think this reflects the extent to which we are being called upon to deeply reflect on a role of historical racisms that have brought us to the point where we are today. Racism should have been immediately confronted in the aftermath of the end of slavery. This is what Dr. Du Bois's analysis was all about. Not so much in terms of, well, what are we going to do about these poor people who have been enslaved so many generations, but rather, how can we reorganize our society in order to guarantee the incorporation of previously enslaved people? Now, the attention is being turned towards the symbols of slavery, the symbols of colonialism, and of course, any campaigns against racism in this country have to address in the very first place the conditions of indigenous people. I think it's important that we're seeing these demonstrations, but I think at the same time, we have to recognize that we cannot simply get rid of the history. We have to recognize the devastatingly negative role that history has played in charting the trajectory of the United States of America. And so I think that these assaults on statues represent an attempt to begin to think through what we have to do to bring down institutions and re-envision them, reorganize them, create new institutions that can attend to the needs of all people.
And what do you think should be done with statues, for example, to, slaveholding founding fathers like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson?
Well, museums can play an important educational role. And I don't think we should get rid of all of the vestiges of the past, but we need to figure out context within which people can understand the nature of U.S. history and the role that racism and capitalism and heteropatriarchy have played in forging that history.
Can you talk about racism and capitalism? You often write and speak about how they are intimately connected and talk about a world that you envision.
Yeah, racism is integrally linked to capitalism, and I think it's a mistake to assume that we can combat racism by leaving capitalism in place. As Cedric Robinson pointed out in his book, Black Marxism, capitalism is racial capitalism. And of course, to just say for a moment that Marx pointed out that what he called primitive accumulation, capital doesn't just appear from nowhere. The original capital was provided by the labor of slaves. The Industrial Revolution, which pivoted around the production of capital, was enabled by slave labor in the U.S. So I'm convinced that the ultimate eradication of racism is going to require us to move toward a more socialist organization of our economies, of our other institutions. I think we have a long way to go before we can begin to talk about an economic system that is not based on exploitation and on the super exploitation of Black people, Latinx people, and other racialized populations. But I do think that we now have the conceptual means to engage in discussions, popular discussions about capitalism. Occupy gave us new language. The notion of the prison industrial complex requires us to understand the globalization of capitalism. Anti-capitalist consciousness helps us to understand the predicament of immigrants who are barred from the U.S. by the wall that has been created by the current occupant. These conditions have been created by global capitalism. And I think this is a period during which we need to begin that process of popular education, which will allow people to understand the interconnections of racism, heteropatriarchy, capitalism.
Angela, do you think we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in this country?
Well, that might be, one way to begin, but I know we're going to need a lot more than truth and reconciliation, but certainly we need truth. I'm not sure how soon reconciliation is going to emerge, but I think that the whole notion of truth and reconciliation allows us to think differently about the criminal legal system. It allows us to imagine a form of justice that is not based on revenge, a form of justice that is not retributive. So I think that those ideas can help us begin to imagine new ways of structuring our institutions, such as, not structuring the prison, because the whole point is that we have to abolish that institution in order to begin to envision new ways of addressing the conditions that lead to mass incarceration, that lead to such horrendous tragedies as the murder of George Floyd.
The legendary scholar and activist Angela Davis. When we come back, we'll talk about the 2020 election and more. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. We're spending the hour looking at the ongoing uprisings against police brutality and racism following the police killing of George Floyd on Memorial Day. Later in the program, we'll hear from Professors Cornel West, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, and Tamika Mallory. But first, we continue our discussion with the legendary scholar and activist Angela Davis. I spoke to her in early June, a week before she received the Fred L. Shuttlesworth Award from the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute in her hometown of Birmingham, Alabama. The Institute made international headlines last year when the Institute initially rescinded the award due to Angela Davis's support for Palestinians and the BDS movement, that's boycott, divestment, and sanctions. After outcry, the Institute reversed its decision. Angela Davis formally received the award on Juneteenth. That's June 19th this year. I asked her about the significance of what happened.
A lot has happened over the last period, including within the context of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. They have completely reorganized. They have reorganized their board. They have been involved in conversations with the community. Of course, as you know, the mayor of Birmingham was threatening to withdraw funding from the Institute. There was a generalized uprising in the Black community. And, while at first it was a total shock to me that they offered this award to me and then they rescinded it, I'm realizing now that that was an important moment because it encouraged people to think about the meaning of human rights. And why is it that Palestinians could be excluded from the process of working toward human rights. Palestinian activists have long supported Black people's struggle against racism. When I was in jail, solidarity coming from Palestine was a major source of courage for me. In Ferguson, Palestinians were the first to express international solidarity. There has been this very important connection between the two struggles for many decades, so that I'm going to be really happy to receive the award, which now represents a rethinking of the rather backward position that the Institute assumed that Palestinians could be excluded from the circle of those working toward a future of justice, equality, and human rights.
Speaking about what's going on in the West Bank right now and about the whole issue of international solidarity, the global response to the killing of George Floyd, in the occupied West Bank, protesters denounced Floyd's murder and the recent killing of Iyad el-Halak, a 32-year-old Palestinian special needs student who was shot to death by Israeli forces in occupied East Jerusalem. He was reportedly chanting Black Lives Matter and Palestinian Lives Matter when Israeli police gunned him down, claiming he was armed. These links that you're seeing, not only in Palestine and the United States, but around the world, the kind of global response, the tens of thousands of people who marched in Spain, who marched in England, in Berlin, in Munich, all over the world, as this touches a chord and they make demands in their own countries, not only in solidarity with what's happening in the United States. And then I want to ask you about the U.S. election that's coming up in November.
Yes, Palestinian activists have long supported Black people's struggle against racism, as I pointed out, I'm hoping that today's young activists recognize how important Palestinian solidarity has been to the Black cause, and that they recognize that we have a profound responsibility to support Palestinian struggles as well. I think it's also important for us to look in the direction of Brazil, whose current political leader competes with our current political leader in many dangerous ways, I would say. Brazil, if we think we have a problem with racist police violence in the United States of America, look at Brazil. Marielle Franco was assassinated because she was challenging the militarization of the police and the racist violence unleashed there. I think 4,000 people were killed last year alone by the police in Brazil. So I'm saying this because
and of course, the president of Brazil, a close ally of President Trump. We only have 2 minutes, and I want to get to the election. When I interviewed you in 2016, you said you wouldn't support either main party candidate at the time. What are your thoughts today for 2020?
Well, my position really hasn't changed. I'm not going to actually support either of the major candidates, but I do think we have to participate in the election. I mean, that isn't to say that I won't vote for the Democratic candidate. What I'm saying is that in our electoral system as it exists, neither party represents the future that we need in this country. Both parties remain connected to corporate capitalism. But the election will not so much be about who gets to lead the country to a better future, but rather how we can support ourselves and our own ability to continue to organize and place pressure on those in power. And I don't think there's a question about which candidate would allow that process to unfold. So I think that we're going to have to translate some of the passion that has characterized these demonstrations into work within the electoral arena, recognizing that the electoral arena is not the best place for the expression of radical politics. But if we want to continue this work, we certainly need a person in office who will be more amenable to our mass pressure. And to me, that is the only thing that someone like Joe Biden represents. But we have to persuade people to go out and vote to guarantee that the current occupant of the White House is forever ousted.
The legendary scholar and activist Angela Davis. When we come back, we'll speak to Cornel West, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, and we'll hear from Tamika Mallory. Stay with us.